Sometimes you reach a point where you just need to disappear for a while. At 63, Dorla Wynn bought 5 acres of forgotten Tennessee mountain land for $100 because she had nowhere else to go. The property was overgrown with weeds. There was a sagging porch and a shed out back that looked ready to collapse. She wasn't planning to fix anything. She just wanted quiet. But when she broke open the rusted lock on that old shed and stepped inside, everything changed. Behind a chained door was something that had been hidden for decades. Something valuable, something that didn't belong to her. Now she had to decide what to do with secrets from someone else's past. What was behind that door? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive up to the property had taken Dorla Wynn 6 hours from Memphis, and every mile felt like peeling away a layer of skin she no longer needed. The city had been her home for 35 years, but home was a word that had lost its meaning somewhere between her husband's funeral and the last argument with her daughter. Now it was just a place where she'd paid rent and sorted mail and pretended everything was fine. She'd worked for the postal service since she was 28, started as a carrier, walking the same routes until she knew every crack in every sidewalk, every dog that barked behind every fence. Eventually, they moved her inside to sorting, and she spent the next 2 decades in a windowless room organizing other people's lives into neat little boxes. Letters from lovers, bills from creditors, birthday cards from grandparents. She'd handled millions of pieces of mail, each one a tiny fragment of someone's story. And not once had anyone asked about hers. Her postal worker badge sat in the glove compartment of her old Chevy truck now, next to a half-empty bottle of ibuprofen and a road map so worn the fold lines had torn through. 35 years of service, and all she had to show for it was a cheap piece of metal and a pension that barely covered her expenses. They'd thrown her a retirement party in the break room, grocery store cake, warm soda. Forced smiles from people who'd forget her name by next week. Dorla's husband, Ray, had died 2 years ago. Heart attack in the garden, face down in the tomato plants he'd been so proud of. She found him when she came home from her shift, still wearing her uniform, his hand clutching a trowel. The tomatoes had been beautiful that year. She'd let them rot on the vine. Their daughter, Michelle, had flown in from Atlanta for the funeral. Stayed 3 days. Asked all the right questions about estate planning and life insurance, but never once asked how Dorla was really doing. Michelle had her own life now, a husband who worked in finance, 2 boys in private school, a house with a 3-car garage. Dorla had become an obligation, a box to check on the family duty list. The last real conversation they'd had was 6 months ago. Michelle wanted her to sell the house and move into a senior living community closer to Atlanta. It would be safer, Mom. You'd have people around, activities, we could visit more often. But Dorla knew what that meant. It meant being warehoused with other old people waiting to die, playing bingo and pretending to enjoy mystery meat casseroles. It meant giving up the last scraps of independence she had left. So instead, she'd done something that surprised even herself. She'd seen the land listing online, 5 acres in the Tennessee mountains, owner desperate to sell, no reasonable offer refused. The photos showed a ramshackle cabin with a metal roof, surrounded by overgrown brush and tall trees. The listing mentioned outbuildings, but didn't show them. The price was listed as negotiable. Dorla had offered $100. To her shock, they'd accepted. The transaction had been handled through email and a title company. She'd never spoken to the previous owner, never learned why they were so eager to be rid of the place. The paperwork arrived in the mail. How fitting. And just like that, she owned land in the mountains. Michelle had been furious when she found out, calling it reckless and irresponsible. Said Dorla was having some kind of breakdown. Maybe she was right. The truck's suspension groaned as Dorla turned off the paved road onto a gravel drive that was more suggestion than actual path. Branches scraped the sides of her vehicle, and twice she had to stop to move fallen limbs out of the way. The GPS on her phone had lost signal 20 minutes ago. She was navigating by memory of the satellite images she'd studied, and by the handwritten directions the title company had included with the deed. When the cabin finally came into view, she sat in the truck for a long moment, engine idling, hands still gripping the wheel. It was worse than the photos. The porch sagged in the middle like a broken back. Several windows were cracked, one covered with a sheet of plywood that had weathered to grey. The metal roof was intact at least, though rust bloomed across it in orange patches. Weeds grew waist-high around the foundation, and a massive oak tree loomed over the structure, its branches reaching down like gnarled fingers. Behind the cabin, barely visible through the overgrowth, she could see the outline of the shed. It leaned to one side, its walls made of weathered planks that had once been painted red, but now were the color of dried blood. Dorla turned off the engine. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like pressure against her eardrums. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls. Just wind moving through the trees and the distant call of a bird she couldn't identify. She climbed out of the truck, her knees protesting after the long drive. The air smelled different here, pine and earth and something green and alive that she had no name for. It was early September, and the afternoon sun filtered through the canopy in golden shafts that illuminated dancing dust motes. Her belongings fit in the truck bed: a rolled-up mattress, a duffel bag of clothes, a box of kitchen supplies, another box with books and a few framed photos she couldn't bring herself to throw away, a camping lantern and a battery-powered radio. That was it. 63 years of life packed into a short-bed pickup truck. The cabin door was unlocked. The hinges shrieked when she pushed it open, announcing her arrival to whatever mice or raccoons had made this place home. The interior was a single room with a stone fireplace on one wall, a kitchen area with a rust-stained sink and ancient appliances, and a loft space accessible by a ladder. The floorboards were warped, but seemed solid enough. Someone had left a table and 2 chairs, and in the corner sat an old iron bed frame without a mattress. Dorla walked to the center of the room and stood there, listening to the building settle around her. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by her presence. A spider web stretched across one window, intricate and perfect. She felt the weight of the silence pressing in, and for just a moment, panic fluttered in her chest. What had she done? What was she thinking, coming out here alone, to a place with no electricity, no phone service, no neighbors for miles? But then the panic passed, replaced by something else, something that felt almost like relief. No one knew where she was. No one would call asking for favors. No one would look at her with pity or obligation. She was alone, truly alone, for the first time in her adult life. She spent the rest of the afternoon unloading the truck and making the cabin barely habitable. She swept the floors, cleared out the worst of the cobwebs, and wiped down the kitchen surfaces with water from the hand pump outside. The pump took some working. The handle was stiff, and the first water that came out was brown with rust, but eventually it ran clear and cold. She unrolled her mattress on the iron bed frame and made it up with sheets that smelled like the storage container they'd been packed in. As the sun began to set, she lit the camping lantern and ate a can of soup cold, sitting at the table, staring at the shadows that gathered in the corners of the room. The night sounds were different from the city. Crickets and tree frogs created a constant chorus. Something larger moved through the brush outside, and she heard the rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig. An owl called, low and mournful. The darkness was absolute, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Dorla lay on her mattress, still wearing her clothes. The lantern turned down to a soft glow. Her body ached from the drive and the work, but her mind wouldn't settle. She kept thinking about Michelle's voice on the phone, angry and disappointed. Kept seeing Ray's face in the garden, that moment when she'd realized he was gone and wasn't coming back. She'd come here to disappear, to find some quiet corner where she could stop pretending to be fine, stop playing the role of the widow who was coping well, the mother who understood why her daughter never called. She'd come here to be alone with her failures and her regrets, to let herself fall apart if that's what needed to happen. But as she lay there in the darkness, Listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain night, another thought crept in, one she hadn't expected and didn't particularly want. The shed. That leaning structure out back, barely visible in the overgrowth. Something about it nagged at her, pulled at her attention. The way it was positioned, set apart from the cabin. The way the door had looked, not just weathered, but deliberately secured. A padlock, she'd noticed, rusty but still in place. Who puts a padlock on an abandoned shed in the middle of nowhere? Dorla closed her eyes and told herself it didn't matter. She wasn't here to, solve mysteries or poke around in other people's business. She was here to be left alone. The shed could stay locked. Whatever was in there could stay buried, but even as she thought it, she knew she was lying to herself. Because in 35 years of sorting other people's mail, she'd developed an instinct for secrets. And that shed was keeping one. Morning came early, announced by birds that seemed determined to wake the entire mountain. Dorla lay still for a moment, disoriented by the quality of light coming through the cabin windows. It was softer here, filtered through leaves, nothing like the harsh glare of the city that would hit her apartment at dawn. Her back ached from the mattress on the unforgiving bed frame. Her neck was stiff. She sat up slowly, taking inventory of her body's complaints. 63 years old, and she felt every single one of them this morning. She pulled on her boots and went outside to the hand pump, splashing cold water on her face, gasping at the shock of it. The morning air was cool, almost cold, raising goosebumps on her arms. Mist hung in the trees, giving everything a dreamlike quality. The shed stood about 50 yards behind the cabin, partially hidden by a tangle of blackberry brambles. In the morning light, it looked even more precarious, leaning at an angle that suggested the next strong wind might flatten it completely. But the door was solid, thick wood reinforced with iron straps. And the padlock, despite its rust, looked substantial. Dorla walked toward it, pushing through the tall grass, her boots getting wet with dew. She stopped a few feet from the door, studying it. The lock was old, the kind that needed a key, not a combination. The chain that held it in place was thick, wrapped through an iron hasp that was bolted into the doorframe. She reached out and touched the lock. It was cold, rough with corrosion. She pulled on it experimentally. It held firm. Behind her a branch snapped in the woods. She turned, heart suddenly pounding, but saw nothing. Just trees and shadows and the movement of leaves in the breeze. She was being foolish, jumping at nothing. There was no one out here. That was the point. But as she walked back to the cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Not something threatening exactly. More like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do next. The shed could wait, she told herself. She had more immediate concerns, figuring out how to live without electricity, learning what was edible in the surrounding woods, making the cabin truly livable. The shed was just a building. Whatever was inside had been there for years. It could wait a little longer, but 3 days later, she found herself standing in front of it again, this time with a hammer and a crowbar from the truck's toolkit. The curiosity had become an itch she couldn't ignore. She'd spent 3 days in silence, alone with her thoughts, and her thoughts kept circling back to that locked door. She positioned the crowbar against the hasp and pulled. The metal groaned but held. She tried again, putting her weight into it, and this time she heard something give. One more pull, and the hasp tore free from the weathered wood, taking splinters with it. The chain fell away, and the padlock clattered to the ground. Dorla stood there, breathing hard, the crowbar still in her hand. The door was no longer locked. All she had to do was open it. She reached for the handle, her heart beating faster than it should. This was it. Whatever had been hidden here, whatever secret this place was keeping, she was about to find out. The door swung open with a long, protesting creak, and everything changed. The interior of the shed was dark, thick with dust, that swirled in the shaft of light from the open door. Dorla coughed, waving her hand in front of her face, waiting for her eyes to adjust. The air smelled of old wood and earth and something metallic she couldn't quite place. As the shadows resolved into shapes, she saw what she'd expected. Rusted tools hanging on the walls. A workbench covered in debris, coils of wire and rope. empty paint cans stacked in a corner, the kind of junk that accumulates in forgotten places. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth locking away. But then she noticed the tarp. It covered something in the back corner, a large mound that reached nearly to the ceiling. The tarp itself was heavy canvas, military green, the edges weighed down with concrete blocks. Whoever had placed it there hadn't wanted it moved. Dorla's hands trembled slightly as she grabbed one corner of the tarp and pulled. The canvas was stiff, resistant, but it finally gave way, sliding off with a soft whoosh of displaced air. Underneath was another door. This one was set into the floor, angled against the back wall of the shed. It was built from heavy timbers, reinforced with metal bands, and secured with not one, but two chains wrapped through iron rings. The chains were fastened with padlocks that looked newer than the one on the shed door, as if someone had replaced them over the years, maintaining the security even after abandoning the property. Dorla knelt beside the door, her knees protesting against the dirt floor. She ran her fingers over the wood, feeling the grain, the solidity of it. This wasn't just a root cellar or a storage space. This was something built to last, built to protect or to hide. She returned to the cabin and retrieved her toolbox, along with a flashlight she'd bought before leaving Memphis. The sun was high now, streaming through the shed's gaps and cracks, but she had a feeling she'd need more light for whatever came next. The chains proved more difficult than the hasp on the shed door. The locks were modern, the chains thick and new. Whoever had put them there, whether the previous owner or someone before them, had meant for this door to stay closed. But Dorla was beyond caring about the intentions of strangers. She positioned the crowbar and began working on the iron rings themselves, looking for weakness in the old wood they were anchored to. It took her nearly an hour. Her arms burned with effort, and sweat ran down her back despite the cool air in the shed. But finally, with a crack that echoed in the small space, one of the rings tore free from the timber. The chain went slack, and she was able to work it loose. The second ring took less time. Once she understood the trick of it, the locks fell away. The door was no longer secured. Dorla sat back on her heels, catching her breath. This was the moment. She could still walk away, could drag the tarp back over the door, leave the shed, forget any of this had happened. She could return to her original plan: isolation, quiet, a slow fade into whatever came next. But she'd never been good at leaving questions unanswered. 35 years of sorting mail had taught her that every envelope held a story. And once you glimpsed the corner of something important, you had to know the rest. She grabbed the iron handle, set into the door, and pulled. The hinges were well made, still solid despite the years. The door lifted smoothly, revealing a set of wooden steps leading down into darkness. Cool air flowed up from below, carrying the smell of earth and stone and something else, something preserved, like the air in a museum or a tomb. Dorla clicked on her flashlight and shone it down the stairs. The beam revealed a small room, maybe 8 feet square, with walls of stacked stone and a floor of packed dirt. She could see wooden crates arranged along one wall and what looked like a shelf system on another. She descended carefully, testing each step before putting her full weight on it. The stairs held. At the bottom, she swept the flashlight around the space, taking inventory. There were 4 crates made of rough-hewn wood, each about the size of a footlocker. They had rope handles and metal corner braces, and stenciled on the sides in faded paint were numbers and letters she didn't recognize. Military codes, perhaps, or shipping designations. The lids were nailed shut. On the shelf, she found something more immediately accessible, a leather satchel, the kind a workman might carry. Dorla lifted it down carefully. The leather was stiff but intact, the brass buckles still functional. She opened it and emptied the contents onto the dirt floor. Papers, dozens of them, folded and pressed flat. She sorted through them with careful hands, her flashlight tucked under her chin. The first document was a land deed dated 1946, transferring ownership of this property to Vernon Calloway for the sum of $300. The signature at the bottom was angular and precise. The second was a discharge paper from the United States Army, dated December 1945. Vernon Calloway, honorably discharged, rank of sergeant. Service in the European theatre? Then came a hand-drawn map, sketched on yellowed paper that crackled when she unfolded it. It showed the property boundaries, the cabin, the shed, and various markers in the surrounding woods. Near what must be the creek, she'd heard running water, but hadn't explored that. Far, someone had drawn an X with the notation, foundation stones, but it was the journal that stopped her cold. It was small, bound in cracked leather, the pages foxed and water-stained around the edges. She opened it carefully, turning to the first entry. The handwriting was the same as the signature on the deed, angular, precise, but with a slight tremor that spoke of either haste or emotion. January 17th, 1947, I bought this land because I needed to be alone. After what we saw, what we did, I can't stand the crowds anymore. Can't stand the noise. People think coming home is the end of the war, but they're wrong. The war doesn't end. You just carry it with you, a weight that never lightens. JT came by today, said he had something he needed to talk about, said it was important. I told him I didn't want to be involved in anything anymore, but he's my friend. He saved my life in Bastonia. You don't forget that kind of debt. Dorla read on, her flashlight beginning to dim, the batteries protesting. The entries were sporadic, sometimes separated by weeks or months. Vernon Calloway wrote about his isolation, his nightmares, his attempts to build a life in the mountains. And he wrote about JT, always just initials, never a full name, who visited regularly, who seemed troubled, who was involved in something Vernon called the arrangement. March 3rd, 1947, JT was here again last night. Came late after dark. He looked terrible, scared in a way I haven't seen since the war. Said he needed a favor. Said he needed to keep something safe for a while. Said if anyone found out, it would destroy everything. I asked what it was. He wouldn't tell me exactly, just said it was valuable. Government property. Said there had been an incident, and he needed time to figure things out. I shouldn't have agreed. But he's my friend, and after what he did for me, how could I say no? April 15th, 1947, we built the room under the shed. Worked at night mostly. JT brought the materials. Said nobody could know, not even his wife. Especially not his wife. Whatever he's hiding, it's heavy. Took both of us to carry the crates down the stairs. He wouldn't let me look inside. Just kept saying it was safer this way, that what I didn't know couldn't hurt me. I think I made a mistake. The entries grew more anxious, more paranoid. Vernon wrote about hearing things in the woods, about seeing vehicles on the road below, about feeling watched. He wrote about JT visiting less frequently, about the weight of the secret becoming harder to bear. And then, dated November 8th, 1947, there was a single line, JT is dead. I don't know what to do. After that, the entries became sporadic and increasingly desperate. Vernon wrote about his guilt, about his fear of discovery, about not knowing whether to report what he knew or keep silent. He wrote about his loyalty to a dead friend, warring with his sense of right and wrong. The final entry was dated February 14th, 1948. I'm leaving. I can't stay here anymore. Every time I look at that shed, I see JT's face. Every time I close my eyes, I see what happened to him. Whoever finds this, I'm sorry. I tried to do the right thing. I tried to be loyal. In the end, I don't think I was either. The truth is in the crates. Do what I couldn't. Dorla sat on the dirt floor of the hidden room, the journal in her lap, her flashlight casting long shadows on the stone walls. Vernon Calloway had vanished in 1948, leaving behind his land, his secrets, and these cryptic messages about loyalty and truth. She looked at the 4 crates stacked against the wall. Whatever JT had hidden, whatever Vernon had protected for him, it was still here, still waiting. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for the nearest crate. The nails had rusted, and they came free easily when she worked the crowbar under the lid. The wood groaned and split, and then the lid was off, falling to the dirt floor with a soft thud. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that crackled when she touched it, were more papers, official documents with government seals. ledgers filled with columns of numbers, photographs of men in uniform. And underneath it all, a newspaper clipping, yellow and brittle. The headline read, "Army Payroll Transport Missing, $200,000 Unaccounted For." The date was April 1st, 1947. Dorla sat back, her mind racing. An army payroll, $200,000 in 1947, worth millions today if it was in bonds or bearer certificates. And Vernon Calloway, a war veteran living alone in the mountains, had helped hide it. But why? And what had happened to JT? She realized, as she sat there in the darkness beneath the shed, that she'd stumbled into something far bigger than an abandoned property. She'd found someone's unfinished story, someone's burden, someone's guilt, and now, whether she wanted it or not, it was hers. Dorla carried the journal and the newspaper clipping back to the cabin, leaving the crates undisturbed for now. Her mind felt overloaded, unable to process what she'd discovered. She made coffee on the camp stove she'd brought, using bottled water, and sat at the table as afternoon faded into evening. The journal lay open in front of her, Vernon Calloway's words staring up at her like an accusation. She read through the entries again, more slowly this time, looking for details she'd missed. Vernon had been 24 when he bought the property, fresh from the war, traumatized by what he'd seen and done. The entries painted a picture of a man trying desperately to outrun his memories, seeking isolation in these mountains the way other veterans sought. Crowds or drink or violence, JT appeared in the journal regularly throughout. 1946 and early 1947, he was described as a friend from the war, someone who had saved Vernon's life during the Battle of the Bulge. Vernon never elaborated on the specifics, just referenced Bastogne and what JT did, with the kind of shorthand people use when the details are too painful to write down. The two men seemed close. JT visited often, helped Vernon with repairs to the cabin, went hunting with him in the woods. There were glimpses of normalcy in those entries. Two friends rebuilding their lives after war, finding peace in the mountains. But then something changed in March 1947. JT arrived late at night, frightened, asking Vernon to hide something. Government property, valuable. And Vernon, bound by loyalty and the debt he felt he owed, had agreed without asking too many questions. They'd built the hidden room together, working in secret. And whatever was in those crates, it had been heavy enough to require both men to carry it. The newspaper clipping provided more context. An Army payroll transport had gone missing between Fort Campbell and Nashville on March 28, 1947. The vehicle had been found abandoned on a back road, the two guards inside dead from gunshot wounds. The payroll, $200,000 in bearer bonds, was gone. Bearer bonds. Dorla knew enough about them to understand why they'd be attractive to thieves. They weren't registered to any specific owner. Whoever held them could cash them in. No questions asked. In 1947, $200,000 would have been worth perhaps $5 million in today's money. Maybe more, depending on the interest and how they'd matured. But if JT had stolen the payroll, why had he brought it to Vernon? Why hide it instead of running with it? And how had he died? Dorla closed the journal and rubbed her eyes. She was tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from physical work combined with mental overload. But her mind wouldn't settle. Questions circled like birds overhead, refusing to land. She forced herself to eat. Canned stew heated on the camp stove, bread that was starting to go stale. The evening darkened into night, and she lit her lantern, turning the flame low to conserve fuel. Outside, the mountain sounds rose up again. Crickets and frogs, the rustle of wind, the distant yip of what might have been coyotes. Her phone, useless for calls without signal, still had some battery life left. She'd charged it before leaving Memphis, thinking she might use it for photos or reading. Now she pulled up the web browser, hoping she might still have cached pages from her earlier research about the property. Nothing useful. Just the real estate listing and some basic county records. No mention of Vernon Calloway. No mention of missing payrolls or dead guards. The property had changed hands several times since 1948, each owner apparently unaware of what lay hidden beneath the shed. Or perhaps they'd known and chosen to leave it alone. Perhaps the secret had been passed down, whispered from seller to buyer, until it finally reached someone who just wanted to be rid of it. Someone who would accept $100 and ask no questions. Dorla set the phone aside and picked up the journal again. Turning to the entry about JT's death. November 8th, 1947, JT is dead. I don't know what to do. He came to me 3 days ago in the middle of the night. He was hurt, shot, bleeding from his shoulder and side. Said it had all gone wrong. Said the others had turned on him. I did what I could. I was a medic during the war, so I knew enough to clean the wounds, stop the bleeding. But one of the bullets had gone deep into his lung, I think. He was coughing blood. He told me what happened. There were 3 of them who planned it, JT and 2 others. They'd been watching the payroll transports for months, looking for an opportunity. JT said it was supposed to be clean. Nobody was supposed to get hurt, but when they stopped the transport, the guards fought back. One of the other men panicked and started shooting. Both guards died. JT said he tried to stop it, but it was too late. They took the bonds and ran. They were supposed to split it 3 ways and disappear. But the other 2 men got greedy. They wanted JT's share. Tried to kill him and take everything. He got away, took his portion of the bonds, and came here. Said he needed time to heal, time to figure out what to do. Said he'd made a terrible mistake and didn't know how to make it right. He died yesterday morning. The infection had gotten into his blood. There was nothing I could do. I buried him near the old foundation stones by the creek. Couldn't take him to town. Couldn't explain what had happened. His wife will never know what became of him. His children will grow up thinking their father abandoned them. I should turn myself in. Should tell someone what I know. But JT saved my life in Bastogne. I owe him everything. And if I talk, his family will know what he did. They'll know he was a thief and a part of murder, even if he didn't pull the trigger. So I'm keeping the secret. God forgive me, I'm keeping it. Dorla read the entry 3 times, her heart heavy. Vernon Calloway hadn't been a thief. He'd been a friend, trying to protect another friend's reputation, even in death. He'd carried the weight of that secret for months, maybe years, before finally fleeing the property and disappearing. And JT, whoever he was, had died trying to escape the consequences of a crime that had spiraled out of control. He'd been buried in an unmarked grave, his family never knowing the truth. The parallel to her own life struck her suddenly. She'd spent years avoiding hard truths, avoiding difficult conversations with her daughter, avoiding the grief of losing Ray. She'd been carrying secrets too, not criminal ones, but emotional ones. The secret that she blamed herself for Ray's death, for not noticing the signs of his failing heart. The secret that she resented Michelle for being distant even as she pushed her away. The secret that she'd come to these mountains not to find peace, but to punish herself with isolation. Vernon Calloway's story was a mirror. A life paralyzed by loyalty and guilt, unable to move forward or back. But Vernon had left her a message in his final journal entry. Do what I couldn't. He'd wanted someone to find this. Someone to make the choice he'd been too paralyzed to make. Someone to finish what he'd started. Dorla closed the journal and set it aside. Her hands were steady now, her mind clearing. She had a choice to make, just as Vernon had. She could walk away from this, report it anonymously, and let the authorities handle it. Or she could dig deeper, try to understand the full story before deciding what to do with it. The phone on the table buzzed, startling her. Signal had flickered back for a moment, just long enough for a text message to come through. It was from Michelle. Mom, please call me. I'm worried about you. This isn't like you. Dorla stared at the message. Her daughter was worried. After months of distance, of obligatory check-ins and tense conversations, Michelle was worried. The signal flickered out again before Dorla could respond. The message sat there, unanswered, a reminder of the world she'd left behind. She thought about calling back, about driving to where she could get signal and explaining everything. But what would she say? That she'd found a dead man's confession and a fortune in stolen bonds? That she was living in a cabin with no electricity, obsessing over a mystery from 77 years ago? Michelle would think she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had. Dorla turned off the lantern and lay down on her mattress, still fully clothed. Through the window, she could see stars, more stars than she'd ever seen in Memphis, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The beauty of it made her throat tight. Tomorrow she would go back to the shed. She would open the other crates and see what else Vernon and JT had hidden. She would try to piece together the rest of the story, and then she would decide what to do with it. But tonight, she would let herself feel the weight of it. The sadness of Vernon's life, JT's death, the families left behind with questions that would never be answered. She would let herself feel all of it, because that's what she'd come here to do. To feel things again, instead of numbly pushing through each day. The mountains held secrets. So did she. Maybe that's why she'd been drawn to this place. Maybe that's why she'd paid $100 for land that no one else wanted, because secrets recognize each other. And sometimes they need to be set free. Morning came with rain, a soft, steady drumming on the metal roof that woke Dorla before dawn. She lay listening to it, grateful for the sound. It felt cleansing somehow, as if the mountain itself was washing away the dust of decades. She made coffee and stood on the sagging porch, watching the rain fall through the trees. Mist rose from the ground, giving everything a ghostly quality. She could barely see the shed from here, just a dark shape in the grey morning. The journal had mentioned a photograph. Dorla had seen it the night before, tucked into one of the back pages, but she'd been too overwhelmed to pay it much attention. Now she retrieved it and studied it in the better light of morning. 4 men in army uniforms, standing in front of what looked like a military barracks. The photo was faded, the faces slightly blurred, but she could make out details. One of the men, tall, broad-shouldered, with a serious expression, had been circled in pencil. Below the circle, someone had written JT. She examined his face, trying to see past the blur and the decades. He looked young, maybe mid-20s. Strong jaw, intense eyes, the kind of face that suggested competence and command. The other 3 men were smiling, but JT wasn't. He stared at the camera with an expression that might have been determination or might have been fear. Vernon Calloway was easy to identify once she knew what to look for. He was shorter than JT, slighter, with a narrow face and wire-rimmed glasses. He was the only one in the photo who wasn't looking at the camera. Instead, he was looking at JT, his expression almost protective. Friends, brothers in arms. The kind of bond formed in war, tested under fire, strong enough that Vernon would risk everything to protect JT's secret. Dorla needed more information. The journal had given her the outline of the story, but there were too many gaps. She needed to know who JT was, what had happened to the other 2 thieves, whether anyone had ever been caught or punished for the murders of those guards. The nearest town was 45 minutes away on winding mountain roads. She'd pass through it on her way to the property, a small place called Ridgeline, with 1 main street, a gas station, a diner, and not much else. But there had been a library. She'd noticed it because it looked incongruously grand for such a small town. A brick building with white columns that suggested someone with money had cared about books. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time she reached her truck. She locked the cabin, a futile gesture given how easy it would be to break in, but habits were hard to break, and started the engine. The windshield wipers scraped across the glass, clearing streaks of mud and pine needles. The drive took longer than she remembered. The rain had turned parts of the gravel road into red mud, and twice her tires spun before finding purchase. But eventually she made it to paved road, and then to Ridgeline. The town looked even smaller in daylight, just a cluster of buildings along a 2-lane highway. The library was indeed impressive, clearly the work of some long-ago benefactor who'd wanted to leave a legacy. Dorla parked in the nearly empty lot and hurried through the drizzle to the entrance. Inside, the smell of old books and furniture polish enveloped her. The space was larger than she'd expected, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in grey morning light. A few people sat at tables, reading newspapers or working on laptops connected to extension cords that snaked across the floor. The front desk was occupied by a woman who looked to be in her early 60s, with steel grey hair pulled back in a bun and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She looked up as Dorla approached, her face arranging itself into a professional smile. "Good morning. Can I help you find something?" "I hope so," Dorla said. "I'm looking for historical records. Newspapers from the late 1940s, if you have them." The woman's smile became more genuine, her eyes lighting up with interest. "We do, actually. We've got the Ridgeline Sentinel on microfilm going back to 1923, and we also have some regional papers from that era." "What are you researching?" Dorla hesitated. How much should she reveal? "I recently bought some property up in the mountains. I'm trying to learn about its history. The previous owner was a man named Vernon Calloway. He owned it in the late 1940s. "Calloway," the woman repeated, her expression thoughtful. "That name sounds familiar. I'm Gretchen Poole, by the way. I've been the librarian here for 30 years, so I know a bit about local history." Dorla Wynn. They shook hands across the desk. "Calloway," Gretchen said again, her brow furrowed. "I feel like I've seen that name in the old property records. Let me check something." She turned to her computer and typed, her fingers quick and confident. After a moment she nodded. "Yes, here it is. Vernon Calloway purchased 5 acres on Mountain Laurel Road in 1946. The property was foreclosed and sold at auction in 1951 after he failed to pay taxes for 3 years. You must have bought the same parcel." "That's the one," Dorla confirmed. "Do you know anything else about him?" Gretchen thought for a moment. "The name has come up in other contexts, I think. There were some rumors back in the day, before my time, but my grandmother mentioned it once. Something about a man who disappeared from that property, left everything behind and just vanished." She paused. "But you know how small-town gossip works. Half of it's made up, and the other half is exaggerated. What about army payroll robberies?" Dorla asked, keeping her voice casual. "Were there any incidents like that in this area around 1947? Gretchen's eyebrows rose. "That's very specific. What makes you ask?" Dorla had prepared for this question. "I found an old newspaper clipping in the cabin. It mentioned something about a missing payroll transport. I was curious about the story." Gretchen said, clearly intrigued now. "I don't recall anything like that off the top of my head, but let me show you how to use the microfilm readers. You can search through the archives yourself. The Sentinel would have covered any major crimes in the region." She led Dorla to a back room where 2 ancient microfilm readers sat on a table, humming quietly. Gretchen pulled boxes of film from metal cabinets, checking dates and labels. "Here," she said, setting down several boxes. "These cover 1947 through 1948. The index isn't great, I'm afraid. You'll have to scroll through manually. But if there was a major crime like a payroll robbery, it would definitely be front-page news." Dorla thanked her and settled in at one of the readers. The machine was older than she was, with a crank handle to advance the film and a focus knob that barely worked. But after a few minutes of fumbling, she got the hang of it. She started with January 1947 and worked forward, scanning headlines and articles. Local news, church socials, high school sports, obituaries. The rhythm of small-town life preserved on yellowing newsprint. Then, on April 3, 1947, she found it, "Army payroll stolen, 2 guards murdered." The article was longer and more detailed than the clipping she'd found in the shed. It described how an army transport vehicle had been ambushed on a back road between Fort Campbell and Nashville. The 2 guards had been shot and killed. The payroll, $200,000 in bearer bonds, had been taken. Federal authorities were investigating. No suspects had been identified. Dorla read through the next several weeks of papers, looking for follow-up stories. There were a few. Updates on the investigation, a funeral notice for one of the guards, statements from military officials promising justice, but no arrests, no recovered bonds. The story gradually disappeared from the front page, replaced by other news. She continued scrolling, looking for any mention of Vernon Calloway, or anyone with the initials JT in the June 12, 1947 edition. She found something. Local sheriff reported missing Sheriff James Timothy Warren. 28, has been reported missing by his wife Eleanor. Warren was last seen leaving his home on the evening of June 9th, telling his wife he was following up on a lead related to an ongoing investigation. He did not specify which case. Warren has served as county sheriff for 2 years and is well respected in the community. He is a decorated World War II veteran who served in the 101st Airborne Division. Anyone with information about Sheriff Warren's whereabouts is asked to contact the sheriff's office immediately. Dorla sat back, her heart pounding. JT was James Timothy Warren. Sheriff James Timothy Warren, not a thief, a lawman investigating a theft. Everything shifted. Vernon's journal took on a completely different meaning. JT hadn't stolen the payroll. He'd been trying to recover it. The 2 other men he'd mentioned, they were the actual thieves. They'd killed the guards, taken the bonds, and then turned on JT when he got too close. But why had JT brought the bonds to Vernon? Why hide them instead of turning them in? Dorla printed copies of both articles, along with several others that mentioned the payroll robbery and Warren's disappearance. Gretchen helped her with the printer, glancing at the headlines with obvious curiosity. "So it's connected to your property?" she asked. "I think so," Dorla said carefully. "I'm still piecing it together. Well, if you find out anything interesting, I'd love to hear about it. Local history is a passion of mine," Gretchen smiled. "And if you need any more help, you know where to find me." Dorla thanked her and left the library, the printed articles tucked into her jacket to protect them from the drizzle. The rain had picked up again, and the sky was heavy with clouds that promised more to come. She sat in her truck, engine running, heater blowing warm air, and reread the articles. James Timothy Warren, 28 years old, decorated veteran, sheriff, husband. He'd left behind a wife who would never know what happened to him, who would spend the rest of her life wondering if he'd abandoned her or met with foul play. Vernon had buried him near the old foundation stones by the creek. An unmarked grave hidden in the woods, the location known only to a dead man whose journal had survived 77 years. Dorla started the truck and drove back toward the mountains. The rain came down harder now, turning the windshield into a blur of motion. She drove slowly, carefully, her mind working through the implications. If she revealed what she'd found, James Timothy Warren's family would finally have answers. His name could be cleared. He hadn't disappeared in shame. He'd died trying to do his job, but revealing the truth would also mean revealing Vernon Calloway's role in hiding the evidence. It would mean exposing a dead man who'd already suffered enough for his loyalty, and it would mean explaining how she'd found all of this, which would lead to questions about the bonds themselves, bonds that were probably still in those crates, worth millions. Technically government property, but functionally unclaimed for nearly 8 decades. The right thing to do was obvious. Report it all. Let the authorities sort it out. Walk away clean. But life, Dorla had learned, was rarely that simple. She drove through the rain, back to her cabin in the mountains, back to the shed with its hidden room and its buried secrets, back to a choice she wasn't ready to make. The rain continued through the afternoon and into the evening. Dorla sat in the cabin, the printed articles spread across the table, Vernon's journal open beside them. She'd made tea on the camp stove and wrapped herself in a blanket, but she couldn't get warm. The cold she felt was internal, the kind that settles in when you're faced with decisions that have no good answers. She needed to see the rest of what was in those crates. Whatever James Timothy Warren had brought to Vernon that night in 1947, whatever had gotten him killed, it was still down there in the hidden room. And until she saw it all, she couldn't make an informed choice about what to do next. The rain tapered off around dusk. Dorla pulled on her jacket and boots, grabbed her flashlight, and walked through the wet grass to the shed. Water dripped from the trees, and the air smelled of earth and pine and rain-soaked wood. Inside the shed, she carefully descended the stairs to the hidden room. Her flashlight beam swept across the 4 crates. She'd opened one yesterday, the one with the documents and the newspaper clipping. 3 remained sealed. She chose the second crate and worked the crowbar under the lid. The nails gave way with squeals of protest, and the wood splintered slightly. She lifted the lid and set it aside. This crate was different. Instead of documents, it contained items wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax. She unwrapped the first bundle carefully, military medals, a bronze star, a purple heart, campaign ribbons, and a set of dog tags that read, Warren James T. O. Positive, Protestant. Dorla held the medals in her hand, feeling their weight. These weren't the possessions of a thief. They were the treasures of a soldier, a man who'd served with honor. James Timothy Warren had earned these, and Vernon had kept them safe, along with the body of the man who'd worn them. The second bundle contained more personal items. A worn leather wallet with a photograph inside, a young woman with dark hair and a soft smile, presumably Eleanor Warren. A pocket watch that had stopped at 3:47. A wedding ring, gold, with an inscription on the inside, J.T. and Eleanor, 1942. These were the things a man carries when he dies. The small pieces of life that survive us, meaningless to anyone but those who loved us. Dorla's throat tightened. She thought of Ray's wallet, still in the drawer of her dresser in Memphis. She hadn't been able to throw it away, hadn't been able to look at it either. Just left it there, along with his watch and his wedding ring, as if keeping them preserved would somehow preserve him too. She set the personal items aside and opened the third crate. Inside were maps, military tactical maps of the region, with markings and notations in two different hands. She recognized Vernon's angular script on some of the notes. The other hand must be Warren's, rounder, more hurried. The maps showed the back roads between Fort Campbell and Nashville, with the ambush site marked clearly. There were other notations too, locations where the thieves might have hidden, routes they might have taken. This was an investigation in progress, Warren's attempt to track down the men who'd killed the guards. One map showed the area around Vernon's property, with the creek and the old foundation stones marked. Someone, Warren probably, had written a note beside it, safe location. No one comes here. Can think. So Warren had used Vernon's property as a base of operations, a place to work on the investigation away from his office, away from anyone who might be watching. That made sense. If the thieves were local, if they had connections in town, Warren would have needed a secure location. The fourth and final crate was the heaviest. Dorla knew what it contained before she opened it. She could feel the weight of it, the significance. She pried off the lid. Inside, wrapped in canvas and sealed in a metal box marked with army insignia, were the bearer bonds. Bundles of them, each note carefully preserved, each one worth a fortune then and exponentially more now. She didn't count them, didn't need to. The newspaper had reported $200,000 stolen. All of it was here. But there was something else in the crate. A letter, sealed in an envelope that had yellowed with age. The envelope was addressed to whoever finds this in Vernon's handwriting. Dorla's hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in that familiar angular script. If you're reading this, I'm either dead, or I finally found the courage to do what I should have done 77 years ago. Either way, you deserve to know the truth. James Timothy Warren was a good man. He was my friend, my brother in arms, and the reason I survived the war. When he came to me that night in June 1947, bleeding and dying, he told me what had happened. He'd been investigating the payroll robbery since April. He'd figured out who did it. Two men named Boyd and Kessler, both ex-military, both with criminal records. He'd tracked them to a cabin in the hills and confronted them alone, thinking he could bring them in quietly. They shot him, left him for dead, and ran with the bonds. But Warren didn't die right away. He managed to get to the thieves' hideout and recover the bonds before Boyd and Kessler could return. Then he drove to my property because he knew I'd help him, knew I owed him. He was dying when he got here. Knew it too. The bullets had torn through his lung and gut. Nothing I could do would save him. He lasted 2 days, long enough to tell me everything. He made me promise to hide the bonds until he could figure out what to do. Said he didn't trust anyone in town, didn't know who might be working with Boyd and Kessler, who might try to steal them back. He wanted to protect his family, protect his reputation, wanted to make sure the bonds got back to the army the right way. But he died before he could tell anyone. And I was too much of a coward to finish what he started. I buried him by the creek near the old foundation. I kept his badge, his medals, his personal effects, everything that proved who he was and what he'd done. I told myself I was protecting his family from shame. But really, I was protecting myself from having to explain my part in it. The truth is simple. James Timothy Warren died a hero. He recovered stolen government property and gave his life trying to return it. Boyd and Kessler got away, probably fled the state, maybe the country. They were never caught, never punished for what they did. Warren's wife died in 1960, still believing her husband had abandoned her. His daughter grew up thinking her father was either a coward or a criminal. And I let that happen because I was too afraid to speak up. I don't know who you are or how you found this, but I'm asking you to do what I couldn't. Tell the truth. Clear Warren's name. Return the bonds to the government. And if you can, find Warren's daughter, her name is Pauline, last I knew, and tell her that her father loved her and died with honor. I've lived with this secret for too long. It's eaten away at me day by day until there's almost nothing left. I came to these mountains to escape the war, but I've been fighting it every day since. The only way to end it is to tell the truth. Do what I couldn't. Vernon Calloway. Dorla folded the letter carefully and sat back against the stone wall of the hidden room. The flashlight beam illuminated the open crates, the medals glinting in the light, the bundles of bonds stacked neatly in their metal box. Vernon Calloway had known exactly what he was leaving behind. He documented everything, preserved everything, and placed it all here like pieces of a puzzle for someone else to solve. He'd spent decades paralyzed by guilt and fear, unable to move forward or back, and in the end, he'd simply left. But he'd left instructions. A map, a request. Dorla thought about her own life, the way she'd avoided hard conversations with Michelle. The way she'd retreated into solitude rather than face her grief over Ray. The way she'd spent years just going through the motions. She understood Vernon's paralysis, understood the weight of carrying secrets, the exhaustion of pretending everything was fine, but she also understood something Vernon apparently never learned. Paralysis doesn't protect you from pain. It just spreads it out over time, a slow bleed instead of a quick cut. She climbed back up the stairs and stood in the shed, breathing the damp air, listening to water drip from the roof. The rain had stopped, and through the gaps in the walls, she could see the first stars appearing in the clearing sky. James Timothy Warren's daughter was still alive. Gretchen had mentioned it, how Warren's widow had died heartbroken, how the family name had been tarnished. But if there was a daughter, she'd be in her 80s now. Old enough to remember her father, old enough to have lived her whole life under the shadow of his disappearance. Dorla could give that woman answers, could restore her father's honor, could finish what Vernon had started and James Timothy Warren had died trying to do. The question was, did she have the courage Vernon had lacked? She walked back to the cabin as full darkness fell, the stars now blazing overhead in impossible numbers. The mountain was silent except for the usual night sounds. Crickets, frogs, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Inside, she lit the lantern and sat at the table with Vernon's letter and her printed articles. She needed to find Pauline Warren, or whatever her last name was now, if she'd married. She needed to piece together the rest of the story before she could decide how to tell it. But first, she needed to think about what she was willing to risk. Because telling this truth would mean explaining how she'd found it, where she'd been living, what she'd discovered. It would mean exposing herself, her choices, her own flight from responsibility. It would mean stepping out of the shadows and into the light. And after so many years of hiding, that prospect was almost as terrifying as staying hidden. Dorla looked at the photograph of James Timothy Warren, young and serious in his army uniform, looked at the picture of Vernon Calloway, slight and protective beside his friend. Two men who'd been broken by war and circumstance. Two men who'd tried in their own ways to do the right thing. One had died trying. The other had lived with his failure until he couldn't anymore. She wouldn't be the third person to fail them. Tomorrow she'd drive back to town. She'd talk to Gretchen again, see if she could help track down Pauline Warren. She'd start the process of bringing this story to light, no matter where it led or what it cost her, because Vernon had asked, because James Timothy Warren deserved it, and because maybe doing this one difficult thing would teach her how to do the other difficult things she'd been avoiding, how to call her daughter and have a real conversation, how to grieve Ray properly, how to stop running. The mountain had given her a gift, she realized. Not the bonds, those weren't hers and never would be. But the story, the chance to do something that mattered, something that would outlast her, the chance to finish what others had started, the chance to be brave. Sleep wouldn't come that night. Dorla lay on her mattress, watching shadows shift across the cabin ceiling as the lantern flame flickered. Her mind churned through possibilities, consequences, the mechanics of truth-telling after 77 years of silence. By dawn, she'd made her decision. She would find Pauline Warren and tell her privately before involving any authorities. The woman deserved to hear about her father from a human being, not from a federal agent or a news report. And maybe, in the telling, Dorla would understand her own role in this better. She was on the road to Ridgeline by 8 in the morning, stopping at the gas station for coffee and a stale pastry before heading to the library. Gretchen was at her desk when Dorla arrived, sorting through a cart of returned books. "Back so soon?" Gretchen said with a smile. "Find something interesting in those old papers." "I did," Dorla said. "And I need your help with something else. I'm trying to find information about Sheriff Warren's family, specifically his daughter. The articles mentioned her name was Pauline." Gretchen's expression became serious. "Pauline Warren Foster? She still lives in the area, actually, in Knoxville. She's in her 80s now, but she's still sharp as a tack." She paused. "Why are you looking for her?" Dorla had prepared for this question during the long, sleepless night. "I found something on my property. Something that belonged to her father. I think she'd want to have it. Something that belonged to James Timothy Warren." Gretchen's eyes widened. "What kind of something?" "I'd rather explain it to her first," Dorla said carefully. "It's personal, and it's complicated." Gretchen studied her for a long moment, clearly torn between curiosity and respect for privacy. Finally she nodded. "I understand. I don't have her contact information here, but my grandmother knew the family. Still exchanges Christmas cards with Pauline, I think. Let me make a call." She disappeared into a back office, leaving Dorla to wait at a reading table. Through the tall windows, she could see Ridgeline's main street. A handful of people going about their morning, trucks driving past, a dog sleeping on the sidewalk in a patch of sunlight. Small town life, unhurried and familiar. Gretchen returned 15 minutes later with a piece of paper. "I spoke with my grandmother." She called Pauline and explained that someone had found something belonging to her father. "Pauline would like to speak with you." She handed Dorla the paper, which had a phone number and an address in Knoxville, written in careful handwriting. "She said you can call any time today." "Thank you," Dorla said, her heart suddenly beating faster. This was real now. "No more hypotheticals, Dorla," Gretchen said quietly. "Whatever you found, I hope it brings her some peace. She's carried a lot of pain for a long time. The whole town treated her family differently after her father disappeared. There were whispers that he'd run off with the payroll money, or that he'd been killed because he was corrupt. None of it was ever proven, but the suspicion was enough to taint them." Dorla nodded, understanding more now. It wasn't just about a daughter losing her father. It was about a lifetime of shame and suspicion, of growing up under a cloud of doubt. She drove back toward her property, but stopped at a high point on the mountain road where she could get cell phone signal. The view stretched for miles, ridges upon ridges of mountains, fading into blue distance. The kind of view that made you feel small and large at the same time. She dialed the number Gretchen had given her. It rang 3 times before a woman answered. "This is Pauline." The voice was older but strong, with a slight tremor that might have been age or emotion. "Mrs. Foster, my name is Dorla Wynn. Gretchen Poole's grandmother gave me your number. She paused, trying to find the right words. I recently bought some property in the mountains. I found something there that I believe belonged to your father, Sheriff James Timothy Warren." There was a long silence. When Pauline spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. "What did you find? I think this is something we should discuss in person if you're willing. It's not a conversation for the phone, is it?" Pauline's voice broke slightly. "Is it his remains? Did you find where he's buried?" "Yes," Dorla said softly. "I found that. And other things. Things that explain what happened to him." She heard Pauline take a shaky breath. "I'm in Knoxville. Can you come here?" "I can. Or I can bring everything to you, whatever you prefer." "No," Pauline said quickly. "I want to see the property. I want to see where it happened. Can I come there?" Dorla hesitated. The cabin had no electricity, no amenities. It was barely habitable, but she understood the need. Pauline had spent 80 years not knowing, and now she wanted to see the place with her own eyes. "Yes," Dorla said. "You can come here, but I should warn you it's very rustic. There's no power, no running water except a hand pump. It's a difficult place to reach." "I don't care about comfort," Pauline said. "When can I come?" They settled on the next day, Saturday. Pauline would drive up with her son, Thomas, who apparently had insisted on accompanying her. She'd call when they were close, and Dorla would meet them at the main road to guide them in. After hanging up, Dorla sat in her truck for a long time, looking out at the mountains. In 24 hours, she would meet the daughter of a man who died on her property 77 years ago. She would tell a story that had been buried for longer than she'd been alive. And then what? What happened after that? She drove back to the cabin and spent the rest of the day cleaning. It was partly practical. She wanted the place to be presentable, but mostly it was a way to manage her anxiety. She swept and dusted, organized her meager possessions, made sure the path to the shed was clear. She also spent time at the creek, looking for the foundation stones Vernon had mentioned. She found them after a half-hour of searching, old granite blocks, moss-covered and partially buried, marking what must have been a previous structure. And nearby, almost hidden by undergrowth, a slightly raised area of ground with stones arranged in a rough rectangle, James Timothy Warren's grave. She stood there for a long time, thinking about the man buried beneath her feet. A sheriff who'd died trying to do his job, a husband who'd never come home, a father his daughter had never really known. Tomorrow she would bring Pauline here, and together they would decide what to do next. That evening, as darkness fell, Dorla's phone buzzed with a text message. She'd left it on, charging in the truck, checking it periodically for signal. The message was from Michelle. "Mom, I'm really worried. You haven't answered any of my calls. Please let me know you're okay." Dorla stared at the message. Her daughter was worried. Actually worried, not just checking a box on her obligation list. The thought created a complicated tangle of emotions: guilt, gratitude, resentment, love. She typed a response. "I'm fine. Living in the mountains on some land I bought. It's peaceful here. I'll call you soon. I promise." The message sat unsent in her drafts. Her thumb hovered over the send button, but she couldn't quite press it. What would happen when she sent it? Michelle would call immediately, full of questions and concerns. Would want to know why, where, how. Would probably try to talk her into coming back to the city, back to civilization. And Dorla wasn't ready for that conversation yet, not until she'd finished what she'd started here. She deleted the message and turned off the phone. Tomorrow would be hard enough without adding her daughter's worry to the weight she was already carrying. She'd call Michelle after she'd met Pauline, after she'd told the truth, after she'd proven to herself that she could do difficult things. The night sounds rose up around the cabin, the familiar chorus of crickets and frogs, the whisper of wind, the distant call of an owl. Dorla sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching stars wheel overhead. She thought about Vernon Calloway, living in this same cabin, listening to these same sounds, carrying his terrible secret. How many nights had he sat here, unable to sleep, unable to let go, unable to move forward? How many years had he wasted in paralysis before finally running away from a problem that running couldn't solve? She thought about James Timothy Warren, dying in this place, probably in terrible pain, knowing he'd failed to complete his mission, but hoping his friend would finish it, hoping the truth would eventually come out. And she thought about herself, 63 years old, sitting in the darkness, on the edge of making the hardest choice she'd made in decades, the choice to be honest, the choice to be brave, the choice to trust that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, is still worth doing. The bonds were worth millions. She could take them, disappear, never tell anyone, live comfortably for the rest of her life, help Michelle and her grandchildren. That option had occurred to her. How could it not? But it had only taken a moment to dismiss it. Because the bonds weren't the treasure. They were evidence. They were proof. They were the key to clearing a good man's name and giving his daughter the truth she'd been denied for 8 decades. That was worth more than any amount of money. Tomorrow, Pauline Warren Foster would drive up this mountain, and Dorla would give her back her father, not his body, not yet, but his story. His honor, his love, and in doing so, maybe she'd find something of her own that she'd lost along the way. The strength to face hard truths, the courage to make difficult choices, the understanding that running away never solves anything, it just moves the problem to a different location. Dorla stood, her joints protesting the cold, and went inside. She lay down on her mattress, and for the first time since arriving at the property, fell asleep quickly. Her dreams were quiet. No nightmares, no anxieties, just the soft darkness of exhaustion finally met with rest. When she woke in the morning, sunlight was streaming through the cabin windows. It was Saturday, the day that would change everything. She made coffee, washed as best she could with cold water from the pump, and put on clean clothes. Then she gathered everything she'd found, the journal, the articles, the photograph, the letter Vernon had written. She left the medals and personal items in the shed, along with the bonds. Those would wait until after Pauline had seen them, until they'd decided together how to proceed. Around 10, her phone buzzed with a text. They were 15 minutes away. Dorla walked down the gravel drive to the main road, her heart pounding. In a few minutes, she would meet a woman who'd spent her entire life not knowing what happened to her father. And Dorla would give her the answer. Terrible and beautiful and true. A silver sedan appeared around the curve, moving slowly on the narrow mountain road. It pulled over when it saw her, and 2 people got out. The first was a woman in her early 80s, small and thin, with white hair pulled back in a bun. Her face was lined, but her eyes were sharp, assessing. She looked at Dorla with an expression that was equal parts hope and fear. The second was a man in his 50s, presumably her son Thomas. He was tall, grey-haired, with his mother's sharp eyes. "Mrs. Foster," Dorla said. "Pauline, please." The older woman's voice trembled slightly. "Are you Dorla?" "I am." She extended her hand and Pauline took it. The older woman's grip was surprisingly strong. "Thank you for calling me," Pauline said. "I've waited a long time for this." "I know," Dorla said quietly. "Follow me. It's about a half-mile up a rough road. Take it slow." They drove in convoy back to the cabin, parking in the small clearing. Pauline got out slowly, leaning on her son's arm, and looked around at the property, the cabin, the shed, the surrounding woods. "So this is where he came," she said softly. "This is where my father spent his last days." "Yes," Dorla said. "Would you like to sit down? I have a lot to tell you." They sat on the porch, the 3 of them, and Dorla began. Dorla handed Pauline the journal first, watching as the older woman opened it with trembling hands. She read Vernon's first entry aloud, her voice catching on certain words. War, alone, debt. Thomas sat beside his mother, reading over her shoulder, his expression growing more intent with each line. "James Timothy Warren," Pauline whispered, when she reached the first mention of her father's initials. "JT, that's what his friends called him. That's what my mother called him." She looked up at Dorla. "Vernon Calloway knew my father." "They served together in the war," Dorla said. They were close friends. Your father saved Vernon's life at Bastogne. Pauline nodded slowly, as if pieces were finally connecting. He never talked about the war much. But I remember him mentioning Bastogne once. He had nightmares about it. They read through the journal together, Dorla occasionally adding context from the newspaper article she'd found. She showed them the clipping about the payroll robbery, then the one about James Timothy Warren's disappearance. When they reached the entries about her father arriving wounded, about the shooting, about his death, Pauline began to cry silently. Thomas put his arm around her shoulders, his own eyes red. "All these years," Pauline said through her tears, "I thought he'd left us. My mother died thinking he'd abandoned her, or worse, that he'd been corrupt. The whole town whispered about it. I grew up with that shame." "He didn't abandon you," Dorla said quietly. "He died trying to do his job. Vernon wrote it all down. Everything your father told him before he died." She gave Pauline the letter Vernon had written, the one addressed to whoever found the hidden room. Pauline read it aloud, her voice breaking several times. When she reached the part about Boyd and Kessler, about the ambush, and her father recovering the bonds, she looked up sharply. "He got the bonds back?" "Yes," Dorla said. "They're here." "All of them?" "I can show you." But before leading them to the shed, she had one more thing to reveal. She pulled out the photograph of the 4 soldiers, pointing to the man circled in pencil. "Is this your father?" Pauline took the photograph with shaking hands. She stared at it for a long moment, then pressed it to her chest. "Yes, that's him. I've never seen this picture before." She broke off, unable to continue. Thomas took the photograph gently and studied it. "He looks so young. How old was he here?" 23, maybe 24, Dorla said. "This would have been in Europe, probably 1944 or 1945. They sat in silence for a moment, absorbing everything. Finally, Pauline straightened her shoulders and took a deep breath. "I want to see where he's buried. And I want to see what he died protecting." Dorla led them to the shed first. The hidden room was cramped with 3 people in it, but Pauline insisted on descending the stairs herself, waving off Thomas's offered arm. She stood at the bottom, looking at the open crates, and Dorla showed her the contents one by one. When Pauline saw the medals, her father's bronze star, his Purple Heart, she broke down completely. Thomas had to help her to a sitting position on the dirt floor. She held the medals in her hands, running her fingers over them, reading the inscriptions. "I never knew he had these," she said. "After he disappeared, everything just vanished. We had nothing of his except some clothes and papers my mother kept in a box. No medals, no uniform, nothing." Dorla showed her the wallet with Eleanor's photograph, the wedding ring, the dog tags. Each item brought fresh tears, but also something else, a kind of relief. Physical proof that her father had existed, had loved, had been real. Then came the bonds. Dorla opened the metal box and showed them the bundles of bearer certificates, still pristine after 77 years. $200,000 in 1947, Thomas said quietly. "That's got to be worth millions now." "At least," Dorla said. "Probably more with interest and maturation." Pauline looked at the bonds, then at Dorla. "And you found all of this? You could have just taken it. No one would have known." "I would have known," Dorla said simply. "And it's not mine. It belongs to the government. More importantly, the story belongs to your father. He died trying to return these. The least I can do is finish what he started." "Vernon Calloway tried to do the same thing," Pauline said, looking at the journal in her hands.
"But he couldn't. Why?"
"Fear," Dorla said. "Guilt, grief, the same things that paralyze all of us." She paused. "I understand him, actually. I came to these mountains to run away from my own problems. Found his instead. And in trying to solve his, maybe I'm learning to face mine." They climbed back up to the surface, blinking in the bright sunlight. Dorla led them through the woods to the creek, following the path she'd scouted the day before. The foundation stones were easier to spot now that she knew what to look for, and nearby, the slightly raised mound with its border of stones. Pauline stood over her father's grave, silent. Thomas stayed close but gave her space. After a long moment, she knelt and placed her hand on the earth. "Hello, Daddy," she whispered. I'm sorry it took me so long to find you. They stayed there for nearly an hour. Pauline talked to her father quietly, telling him about her life, her marriage, her children, her grandchildren, all the things he'd missed, all the years he'd been gone. Dorla and Thomas stood back, giving her privacy, not speaking. Finally, Pauline stood, brushing dirt from her knees. Her face was composed now, resolved. We need to do this right. He deserves to be honored properly, buried with his family. And the truth needs to come out, all of it. I agree, Dorla said. But I wanted you to hear it first, before we involve the authorities. I thought you deserved that. Thank you, Pauline said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for that. Thank you for calling me instead of just reporting it to some agency. They walked back to the cabin, and Dorla made tea on her camp stove while they discussed next steps. Thomas, who worked as an attorney in Knoxville, had thoughts about how to proceed legally. They'd need to contact the FBI, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, and probably the state police. There would be investigations, verification, probably media attention. But first, Thomas said, we should document everything ourselves. Photos, copies of the documents, witness statements. We need to control the narrative as much as possible to make sure your father's story is told correctly. And Vernon Calloway's story too, Pauline added. He was protecting my father's reputation. He deserves to be remembered for that, not condemned for hiding evidence. They spent the rest of the afternoon photographing everything, the journal, the letters, the bonds, the grave site. Thomas used his phone to record Dorla's account of how she'd found everything, creating a chronological narrative that would help authorities understand the discovery. As evening approached, Pauline and Thomas prepared to leave. But before they got in their car, Pauline turned to Dorla and took her hands. You gave me my father back, she said. Not his body, that will come later, but his honor, his story, the truth about who he was and how he died. I've waited 82 years for that. I can't, her voice broke. I can't thank you enough. You don't have to thank me, Dorla said. I just found it. Vernon left the map. Your father made the sacrifice, but you could have walked away, Pauline insisted. You could have ignored it or taken the bonds and disappeared. But you didn't. That takes courage. That takes character. After they left, Dorla sat on the porch as darkness fell. She felt drained, emotionally exhausted, but also something else. Something lighter. As if a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had been lifted. She'd told the truth. She'd done the difficult thing. And it had mattered. Her phone buzzed. She turned it back on to coordinate with Pauline. A text from Thomas. Mom wants you to know we're contacting the authorities tomorrow. Wanted to give you advance notice. They'll probably want to interview you within the next few days. She typed back, understood. I'll be here. Then she scrolled to Michelle's last message, still unanswered. Her daughter's worry, her concern. Dorla had been running from that too. From Michelle's well-meaning attempts to manage her life. From her own guilt about being a difficult mother. From the complicated tangle of love and resentment that defined their relationship. But if she could face this, if she could tell the truth about James Timothy Warren and Vernon Calloway, then maybe she could start being honest with her daughter. Too, she typed, Michelle, I'm sorry I haven't called. I bought some land in the Tennessee mountains, and I'm living in a cabin here. No electricity or running water, but it's peaceful. I found something important on the property, and I've been dealing with that. I'm okay. Better than okay, actually. I'll explain everything when you're ready to listen. I love you. She hit send before she could change her mind. The response came almost immediately. Mom, what? Are you serious? Call me right now, Dorla smiled. Vintage Michelle, caring and bossy in equal measure. She dialed her daughter's number. Mom. Michelle's voice was sharp with worry and relief. What the hell is going on? You bought land in the mountains. What mountains? Where are you? I'm in Tennessee, Dorla said. About 2 hours from Knoxville. And yes, I bought some property for $100. $100? Mom, that sounds like a scam. Did someone take advantage of you? No, Dorla said, surprised by how calm she felt. I got exactly what I paid for. Some land, a cabin, and apparently a 77-year-old mystery that I've been helping to solve. A mystery? Michelle's voice rose. Mom, are you having some kind of episode? Should I come get you? I'm not having an episode, Dorla said firmly. I'm having a life. For the first time in a long time, I'm actually doing something that matters. And I'm going to tell you all about it, but first, I need you to stop trying to rescue me and just listen. There was a long pause. Then, okay, I'm listening. And so Dorla told her daughter the story. About Vernon Calloway and James Timothy Warren. About the hidden room and the journal and the bonds. About Pauline Warren Foster and her 82 years of not knowing. About courage and cowardice and the space between them where most people live. Michelle listened, interjecting only with occasional questions. And when Dorla finished, her daughter was silent for a long moment. Mom, she finally said, her voice softer now, that's incredible. You really did all that? I did, Dorla said, with help. But yes, I don't know what to say. I mean, I'm still worried about you living in a cabin with no electricity, but Michelle paused. You sound different. Stronger, maybe. I feel different, Dorla admitted. I came here to disappear, to give up. But instead, I found something worth showing up for. Does that make sense? Yeah, Michelle said quietly. It does. Listen, Mom, I'm sorry. For pushing you about the senior living thing. For not asking what you actually wanted. For being so bossy, Dorla supplied, smiling. Michelle laughed, and it was a real laugh, unforced. Yeah, bossy. You raised me to take charge, and sometimes I forget that you don't need me to take charge of you. I did need you, Dorla said. I just didn't know how to ask for the right kind of help. I'm still figuring that out. They talked for another hour, really talked, in a way they hadn't in years. Michelle told her about problems with the boys, about tension in her marriage, about feeling like she was failing at everything. Dorla listened and offered what wisdom she could, surprised by how much she still had to give. When they finally hung up, Dorla sat in the darkness, feeling the mountain night wrap around her like a blanket. Tomorrow the authorities would come. The story would become official, public, probably complicated. But for tonight, she'd done what she needed to do. She'd told the truth. All of them. To Pauline about her father. To Michelle about herself. To herself about why she'd come here and what she'd found. And in the telling, she'd discovered something Vernon Calloway never had. The truth doesn't destroy you. Hiding from it does. The mountain held its secrets lightly now, ready to let them go. And so did she. The federal agents arrived on Monday morning in 2 dark SUVs that looked absurdly official, navigating the narrow mountain roads. Dorla watched from her porch as they parked. 5 people emerging in suits and badges. 3 FBI agents, 1 Army CID investigator, and a representative from the state police. Thomas had warned her this would happen. He'd made the calls himself Sunday evening, setting up a coordinated response. By morning, multiple agencies were involved, each claiming jurisdiction over different aspects of the case. The bonds were federal property. The murders were state crimes. The military angle brought the army in. It was, as Thomas had predicted, becoming complicated fast. The lead FBI agent was a woman in her mid-40s named Sarah Chen. She had kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor, the kind of person who'd heard every story and believed none of them until proven otherwise. Mrs. Wynn, she said, extending her hand. Thank you for cooperating. I understand you've made quite a discovery. Dorla shook her hand. Call me Dorla, and yes, I suppose I have. Come in, though there's not much room. They couldn't all fit in the cabin, so they conducted the initial interview on the porch and in the yard. Agent Chen asked questions, while the others took notes, photographed the property, and began processing the scene. Dorla told the story chronologically, showing them the journal, the documents, Vernon's letter. And you say you found all of this in a hidden room beneath the shed? Chen asked. Yes, I can show you. She led them to the shed and they descended into the hidden room one at a time. The space felt even smaller with multiple people examining it. They photographed everything, bagged the documents as evidence, and carefully inventoried the bonds. The Army investigator, a major named Williams, studied the medals and dog tags with particular interest. Sheriff Warren was a decorated soldier. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, this matches his service record. He looked at Dorla. You could have sold these for significant money on the collector's market. Why didn't you? Because they weren't mine to sell, Dorla said simply. They belonged to a man who died doing his duty. His daughter deserved to have them. One of the FBI agents, younger than Chen, examined the bonds with gloved hands. Bearer certificates unregistered. If these are authentic, and they appear to be, they're worth approximately $8 million at current valuation. Someone whistled softly. $8 million. More than Dorla had imagined, though the number felt abstract. What mattered was what the bonds represented. Proof of James Timothy Warren's honor, vindication for his family, closure for a case that had been unsolved for 77 years. We'll need to take all of this as evidence, Chen said. But I want to assure you, Mrs. Wynn, Dorla, that you won't be in any legal trouble. You found property on land you legally own, and you reported it promptly to the appropriate authorities. There may be a finder's reward, depending on how the restitution is handled. I don't want a reward, Dorla said. I just want the story told correctly. Sheriff Warren died trying to return those bonds. Vernon Calloway protected them, even though it cost him everything. Those men deserve to be remembered as heroes, not criminals, Chen nodded. We'll do our best to ensure that. But I should warn you, this is going to attract media attention. A 77-year-old cold case solved? Missing payroll recovered? It's a significant story. You'll probably have reporters showing up here. Dorla had considered this possibility, but hearing it stated so bluntly made it real. Her quiet mountain retreat was about to become very public. What about the grave? She asked. Sheriff Warren is buried near the creek. His daughter wants him to have a proper burial with his family. We'll arrange for forensic recovery and identification, William said. It'll take time, but Mrs. Foster will be able to inter her father's remains properly once we've completed our investigation. They spent the rest of the morning documenting everything. The agents were thorough but respectful, understanding that this wasn't just evidence to them, it was people's lives. People's pain, people's long-awaited resolution. By early afternoon, they'd finished the initial evidence collection. Jen gave Dorla her card and a case number, explaining that someone would be in touch for follow-up interviews. You did the right thing, Chen said before leaving. A lot of people wouldn't have. They'd have taken the money and kept quiet. But you chose truth over profit. That matters. After they left, Dorla sat on her porch, exhausted. The property felt different now, not violated exactly, but exposed. The secret was out. The hidden room was no longer hidden. James Timothy Warren's grave had been marked with yellow evidence tape, but it was done. She'd finished what Vernon couldn't, what James Timothy Warren had died trying to do. The bonds would be returned to the government. The truth would be recorded. Justice, delayed by 77 years, would finally be served. Her phone rang. It was Pauline. Thomas just called me, the older woman said. The FBI contacted him. They said they've recovered everything, and that they're treating my father's case as a line-of-duty death. That's good, Dorla said. Better than good. They're recommending him for posthumous commendation. And they're going to return his personal effects to me, the medals, the ring, everything. Pauline's voice broke. After all these years, I'm going to have something of his to hold. I'm glad, Dorla said, meaning it deeply. There's something else, Pauline said. The FBI asked me about Vernon Calloway. They wanted to know if I wanted to press charges, obstruction of justice, concealing evidence, that sort of thing. Even though he's dead, it would go on the record. What did you tell them? I said no. Absolutely not. Vernon Calloway was protecting my father's reputation the only way he knew how. He made mistakes, but he did it out of loyalty and love. That's not a crime worth prosecuting, even symbolically. Dorla felt relief wash over her. She'd worried about that Vernon's name would be dragged through investigations and historical judgments, that his attempt to help would be seen only as wrongdoing. Thank you, she said. I think Vernon would appreciate that. They talked for a few more minutes before hanging up. Then Dorla went inside and found Vernon's journal, which the FBI had photocopied but returned to her. She read through it again, understanding him better now. Vernon Calloway had been a good man, broken by war and impossible choices. He'd tried to honor his friend and protect his friend's family, but the weight of the secret had crushed him. In the end, he'd done what he could, documented the truth and hoped someone else would be brave enough to tell it. That evening, Gretchen called. "I heard through the grapevine that federal agents were at your property," she said. "The whole town is buzzing. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Dorla said. "It's a long story, but it's all going to come out soon anyway. You were right about the property having a history." "I knew it," Gretchen said, sounding delighted. "I could tell you'd found something significant. Listen, when you're ready to talk about it, I'd love to hear the full story. For the library's archives, if nothing else. This is important local history. I'll tell you everything," Dorla promised. "But give me a few days to process it all first." That night, alone again in the cabin, Dorla thought about what came next. The immediate crisis was over. The evidence was secured. The authorities were involved. The truth was being processed through official channels. But her life was far from settled. She'd come to these mountains to escape, to disappear. She'd found something that demanded exactly the opposite: engagement, courage, presence. And in rising to that demand, she'd changed. She couldn't go back to being the woman who'd driven up here 3 weeks ago, numb and defeated and ready to give up. But she also couldn't stay here forever, isolated in a cabin with no electricity, hiding from the world. That had never been a real solution, just a temporary retreat. What she needed was something in between, a life that honored both her need for quiet and her capacity for action. A way to be alone without being isolated. A way to be involved without being overwhelmed. She thought about Memphis, about her apartment there with Ray's belongings still in drawers, about the neighbors she'd never spoken to, about the routine that had felt like slowly suffocating. She couldn't go back to that, but she could go forward. The next morning, she drove into Ridgeline and stopped at the real estate office, a tiny shop next to the diner. The agent, a friendly woman named Patricia, was thrilled to help. "I want to buy a house in town," Dorla said. "Something small, simple, within walking distance of the library. Do you have anything like that?" Patricia pulled up listings on her computer. "We actually have a perfect place. It's a cottage on Maple Street, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath. It's been on the market for a while because it needs some updating. The price is very reasonable." They drove to see it. The cottage was exactly what Dorla had imagined, small, modest, with a front porch and a tiny yard. It needed work, but the bones were good. And it was 3 blocks from the library, 4 blocks from the diner, walking distance to everything she'd need. "I'll take it," she said. Patricia blinked. "Don't you want to think about it? Have an inspection?" "It's a big decision. I've been thinking about it all night," Dorla said. "And I've learned recently that sometimes the right decision is obvious if you stop overthinking it." The paperwork would take time, but Patricia assured her they could move quickly. Dorla would keep the mountain property too, use it as a retreat when she needed solitude, but live in town where she could be part of a community. Balance. That's what she'd been missing. Not isolation or immersion, but balance. Over the next few days, the story broke nationally. "Cold case solved after 77 years, read the headlines. "Sheriff's daughter finally gets answers." "Hidden mountain treasure worth millions." Reporters did show up at her property, just as Agent Chen had warned. Dorla gave a few brief interviews, always steering the narrative back to James Timothy Warren and Vernon Calloway, making sure their stories were told correctly. She declined to be photographed, declined to go on television, kept herself as much in the background as possible. This wasn't about her. It was about finishing what others had started. Pauline called frequently with updates. The army was processing the commendation. The FBI had closed the investigation, ruling definitively that James Timothy Warren had died a hero. The bonds were being returned to the Treasury, and there would indeed be a finder's reward, 10% of the recovered value. $800,000. "We want you to have it," Pauline said. "Without you, none of this would have happened." "That's too much," Dorla protested. "It's not enough," Pauline countered. "You gave me my father back. You gave my family our dignity back. Money doesn't measure that, but it's what we can offer. In the end, Dorla accepted it. The money would allow her to buy the cottage outright, make the necessary repairs, live comfortably. Maybe help Michelle's family when they needed it. Maybe donate some to causes that mattered. But more than the money, she'd gained something else: purpose, connection, the understanding that even at 63, even after loss and grief and years of just going through the motions, it was possible to start again, to matter again, to make a difference. 3 weeks after finding the hidden room, Dorla stood in the shed and placed a new padlock on the door. This one was brass, modern, with a key she'd keep in her cabin. The hidden room was empty now, its secrets finally released to the light. But the space remained, a testament to what had been hidden there, a reminder of the weight of secrets and the relief of truth. She locked the door and walked back to the cabin. Tomorrow she'd start packing to move into town. Tonight, one more night in the mountains, in the place where everything had changed. She sat on the porch as darkness fell, watching stars emerge, listening to the familiar sounds of the mountain night. And for the first time in years, maybe decades, she felt at peace, not the peace of escape or numbness, the peace of someone who'd faced hard things and come through them, the peace of finishing what needed finishing, the peace of truth finally told. Vernon Calloway had never found that peace. He'd run from it until running was all he had left, but Dorla had learned his lesson and made a different choice, and that, she thought, made all the difference. The day of James Timothy Warren's memorial service arrived in early October, 6 weeks after Dorla had first broken open that rusted padlock. The leaves had turned, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, and the morning air held the first real bite of autumn. The service was held in Ridgeline's oldest church, a white clapboard building with a tall steeple that had stood for over 100 years. Dorla arrived early, dressed in the one good dress she'd brought from Memphis, and found the church already filling with people. Pauline stood near the front, greeting arrivals. When she saw Dorla, she broke away and embraced her. "Thank you for coming," Pauline said. "It means everything that you're here." "I wouldn't miss it," Dorla said simply. The church continued to fill. Dorla recognized Gretchen and her grandmother, Agent Chen, and Major Williams in dress uniforms, Thomas and his family. But there were also dozens of people she didn't know, townspeople who'd heard the story, veterans who'd come to honor one of their own, reporters documenting the event for posterity. At the front of the church, on a table draped with an American flag, sat James Timothy Warren's recovered remains in a simple wooden casket. Beside it, arranged on stands, were his medals, his badge, and the photograph of him in uniform, the same one Dorla had found in the hidden room, now enlarged and restored. The service began with hymns, old ones that most of the congregation seemed to know by heart. Then the pastor spoke, a young man who'd done his research and told James Timothy Warren's story with respect and accuracy. He spoke of Warren's service in the war, his dedication as a sheriff, and the ultimate sacrifice he'd made in the line of duty. For 77 years, the pastor said, James Timothy Warren was lost to us. His family mourned without closure. His service was questioned. His honor was in doubt. But today, we set the record straight. Today, we acknowledge the truth. Sheriff James Timothy Warren was a hero, and he will be remembered as one. Major Williams came forward to present the posthumous commendations. There were 3, a Purple Heart for wounds received in action, a Medal of Valor from the Sheriff's Association, and a Presidential Citizens Medal recognizing his efforts to protect government property. Pauline accepted them with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. Thomas stood beside her, one arm around his mother's shoulders, his own expression tight with emotion. Then Pauline herself rose to speak. She walked to the podium slowly, her age showing in her careful steps, but when she spoke, her voice was strong. "My father was taken from me when I was 4 years old," she began. "I have only a handful of memories of him. The scratch of his uniform when he hugged me, the way he smelled of tobacco and aftershave, the sound of his laugh. For most of my life, those memories were tainted by not knowing what happened to him." She paused, looking out at the congregation. People talked. They said he'd run away. They said he'd been corrupt. They said he'd abandoned his family. My mother died believing one of those stories, never knowing the truth. I grew up carrying the weight of that uncertainty, that shame. Her gaze found Dorla in the crowd. Then this summer, a woman I'd never met found something on a piece of land she'd bought for $100. She could have ignored it. She could have taken it and disappeared. But instead, she did the hardest thing. She told the truth. And because of her courage, I finally know what happened to my father. I know that he died a hero. I know that he loved us. I know that he never abandoned us. Pauline's voice broke, but she continued. Today, we lay my father to rest with honor, with dignity, with the truth finally told. It's 77 years late, but it's not too late. It's never too late for truth. It's never too late for justice. It's never too late to set things right. The congregation stood and sang Amazing Grace, the old hymn echoing off the wooden walls. Dorla found herself singing along, surprised by how well she remembered the words from her own church-going days, decades ago. Beside her, an elderly veteran in full uniform sang with tears running down his weathered face. After the service, they processed to the cemetery on the edge of town. The plot was in the family section, near where Eleanor Warren had been buried in 1960. The headstone, new and white, read Sheriff James Timothy Warren, 1947, beloved husband and father. Hero and servant of justice, the casket was lowered. Honor guards fired a rifle salute that echoed across the hills. A bugler played taps, the notes mournful and beautiful in the crisp autumn air. Pauline was given the folded flag. She held it to her chest, her eyes closed, and Dorla could see her lips moving, saying something private to her father, something meant only for him. People began to disperse, slowly, respectfully. Dorla started to leave, but Pauline called her back. Wait, she said. There's one more thing. She led Dorla to a second grave marker, new like her father's, set back slightly under an oak tree. This one read, Vernon Calloway, 1921-1948, loyal friend. May he find the peace he sought. Dorla stared at it, her throat tight. You did this? He was part of the story too, Pauline said. He protected my father's memory the only way he knew how. He deserves to be remembered. Thomas tracked down what happened to him. He died in 1948 in Kentucky, alone in a boarding house. He's buried in a pauper's grave there. Someday, maybe we'll bring him home too. But for now, this marker honors what he tried to do. Dorla touched the cold stone, thinking of Vernon's journal, his guilt, his paralysis, his final plea. Do what I couldn't. She had done it. They all had together. Thank you, she whispered, not sure if she was thanking Pauline or Vernon or the universe itself. No, Pauline said firmly. Thank you. For all of it. For caring when you didn't have to. For finishing what others started. For being brave. They stood together in the cemetery as the afternoon light slanted through the trees. Two women who'd been strangers 6 weeks ago, now bound by a shared story of loss and redemption. Behind them, the mountains rose up, ancient and patient, holding their remaining secrets lightly, ready to let them go when the time was right. The reception was held in the church hall, a modest space that somehow managed to accommodate the crowd. Long tables held food brought by community members, casseroles and pies and platters of sandwiches, the kind of funeral food that had sustained small-town gatherings for generations. Dorla found herself surrounded by people wanting to hear the story firsthand. She told it simply, without embellishment, always redirecting focus to James Timothy Warren and Vernon Calloway. This was their day, their recognition. She was just the person who'd happened to find what they'd left behind. Agent Chen approached with a formal-looking envelope. The Treasury Department asked me to give you this, she said. It's the finder's reward, officially processed. $800,000 as discussed. Dorla took the envelope, feeling its weight. Life-changing money. Security for her remaining years. The ability to help Michelle and her grandchildren, to live comfortably in her new cottage, to do good with what she'd been given. There's something else, Chen continued. We found records of the two other men, Boyd and Kessler. They were never caught for the payroll robbery or the murders. Boyd died in 1952 in a prison in California, serving time for armed robbery. Kessler disappeared completely, probably fled to Mexico or South America, so there won't be any justice for them, not after all this time. But at least the record is clear about what happened. That's enough, Dorla said. Warren died trying to set things right. Now everyone knows. That's what matters. Gretchen found her with a cup of coffee and a plate of cookies. I've been documenting everything for the library archives, she said, excitement in her voice. This is the most significant historical event to happen in Ridgeline in decades. Would you be willing to give an oral history interview? For future generations? I suppose I could do that, Dorla said. But again, the focus should be on Warren and Calloway, I know, Gretchen interrupted with a smile. You've made that very clear. But your part matters too, Dorla. You're the one who chose truth over profit. That's worth documenting. Later, Michelle called. Dorla stepped outside to take it, grateful for the fresh air and quiet. How was the service? Her daughter asked. Beautiful, Dorla said. Sad, but also healing, if that makes sense. The man's daughter finally got to say goodbye after 82 years. Mom, I've been thinking, Michelle said, her tone uncharacteristically hesitant. About what you said, about me being bossy and not listening to what you actually needed. I'm sorry for that. And I want you to know that I support what you're doing. The cottage in town sounds perfect. Close enough to people, but still your own space. Thank you, Dorla said, surprised by the tightness in her throat. That means more than you know. And Mom, the boys want to come visit over Thanksgiving. See the mountains, hear the whole story. Meet the woman who found buried treasure. Dorla laughed. It wasn't exactly buried treasure. But yes, I'd love to see them. All of you. I have enough room in the cottage for a visit. We'll be there, Michelle promised. I love you, Mom. I love you too, sweetheart. After the call, Dorla walked around the side of the church to a small garden area where a bench sat beneath an ancient maple tree. She needed a moment alone to process everything that had happened in the past 6 weeks. She'd come to Tennessee to disappear, to escape her grief and her failures and her inability to cope with life after Ray. She'd expected to fade into the mountains, to become someone who didn't matter, who didn't have to make decisions or face hard truths. Instead, she'd found a mystery that demanded she be present, be active, be brave. And in rising to that demand, she'd rediscovered parts of herself she'd thought were lost. The postal worker who'd cared about getting every piece of mail to the right person. The mother who'd once been strong enough to raise a daughter alone when Ray was working long hours. The woman who'd known how to face difficulties instead of running from them. Vernon Calloway had run, had spent years paralyzed by fear and guilt, unable to act, unable to rest. And it had destroyed him slowly, year by year, until there was nothing left but to abandon everything and start over somewhere else. But starting over hadn't worked for him, because you can't run from yourself. Your choices follow you. Your secrets weigh the same whether you carry them in Memphis or Kentucky or the mountains of Tennessee. Thomas approached, interrupting her thoughts. My mother wanted me to give you something, he said, holding out a small jewelry box. Dorla opened it. Inside was James Timothy Warren's compass, the military-issue one that had been with his personal effects. It was brass, worn smooth by years of use, the glass face slightly fogged with age. She wants you to have it, Thomas said. She said you found your way when you needed to, and you helped us find ours. She thought it was fitting. Dorla held the compass, feeling the weight of it. The needle swung and settled, pointing north. Always north, constant and true. Thank you, she said. I'll treasure it. She also wanted me to tell you that you're family now. Anytime you need anything, we're here. That's not just words. That's a promise. Dorla nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She'd come to the mountains alone, expecting to stay that way. But she'd found something better than solitude. She'd found connection, purpose, the understanding that even at 63, even after loss and grief and years of merely surviving, it was possible to live again. Really live. The sun was setting when people finally began to leave. The church hall emptied gradually, conversations winding down, promises to stay in touch exchanged. Dorla helped clean up, washing dishes alongside women she'd just met, but who treated her like an old friend. As she drove back toward her cabin, soon to be just a weekend retreat, not her only home, she thought about the compass in her pocket. Vernon had carried it during the war, had used it to try to find his way in the moral wilderness of his situation. But he'd never found true north, had never figured out which direction to go. Dorla had been lost too, in her own way. But she'd found her direction, not by running away from hard things, but by walking toward them, not by hiding from truth, but by bringing it to light. The mountains were beautiful in the dying light, the autumn colors brilliant against the darkening sky. She'd bought this land for $100, expecting nothing. And she'd gained everything that mattered, a story told, justice served, connections made, a purpose rediscovered, and maybe most importantly, the knowledge that it's never too late. Never too late for truth, never too late for courage, never too late to finish what others started, and in doing so, to find your own way home. 3 months later, Dorla stood on the porch of her cottage in Ridgeline, coffee in hand, watching the first snow of winter dust the mountains in the distance. The cottage had been transformed in the week since closing. Fresh paint, updated plumbing, new windows that actually kept the cold out. It was small but perfect, exactly what she needed. Inside, the walls held the things that mattered now. The photograph of the 4 soldiers, framed and hanging in her living room. Vernon's journal, preserved in a glass case that Gretchen had helped her find. Ray's watch and wedding ring, no longer hidden in a drawer, but displayed on a shelf alongside her own memories. And James Timothy Warren's compass, sitting on her desk, a reminder of what it meant to find your way. The money from the finder's reward had done what she'd hoped. The cottage was paid for. She'd sent a generous check to Michelle for the boys' education, ignoring her daughter's protests. And she'd established a scholarship fund at the local high school, in the names of James Timothy Warren and Vernon Calloway, ensuring their story would continue to matter to future generations. Life in Ridgeline had settled into a comfortable rhythm. She volunteered at the library 3 days a week, helping Gretchen with archives and research. She'd joined a book club that met at the diner every Thursday evening. And she'd started writing, not for publication, but for herself, documenting the full story of what she'd found and what it meant. The mountain property remained hers, a retreat when she needed solitude. She went there most weekends, spending Saturday nights in the cabin that she'd gradually made more comfortable. But it was no longer an escape. It was just a place she went, a different kind of home. Michelle and the boys had visited over Thanksgiving as promised. The boys had been fascinated by the story, by the hidden room beneath the shed, by the idea of buried treasure and mysteries solved. They'd hiked to the old foundation stones and the graves, treating it like an adventure, while understanding in their young way that it was more than that. Michelle had been different too, less pushy, more willing to listen. They'd sat on the cottage porch one evening, just the 2 of them, and talked about Ray. Really talked, sharing memories and grief and the complicated love that survives death. It wasn't healing exactly, but it was honest. And honesty, Dorla had learned, was the foundation everything else was built on. Pauline called once a week, regular as clockwork. They'd become friends, these 2 women bound by a story that had needed telling. Pauline had moved her father's wedding ring to a chain she wore around her neck. His medals were displayed in her home, along with the flag from his service. And she'd started her own project, researching the other members of his unit, trying to preserve their stories before time erased them completely. The media attention had faded, as media attention always does. The story had been told, the mystery solved. The next news cycle had moved on. Occasionally, someone recognized Dorla's name, asked if she was that woman who found the treasure. She'd correct them gently. It wasn't treasure, it was truth, and redirect the conversation, because that was the lesson she'd learned in these mountains. Money wasn't treasure. Comfort wasn't peace. Isolation wasn't safety. The real treasure was connection, purpose. the courage to face difficult things, and the strength to see them through. Vernon Calloway had spent years seeking peace through isolation. It had destroyed him slowly, year by year, until he'd had to abandon even that final refuge. James Timothy Warren had sought peace through duty, and it had cost him his life, but preserved his honor. Dorla had found her own path, somewhere between those extremes. Not isolated, but not consumed. Present, but not overwhelmed. Connected, but not dependent. She finished her coffee and went inside to prepare for the day. She was meeting Gretchen at the library to work on a display about local history. Then lunch with Pauline, who was driving in from Knoxville. Then home to read, maybe write a little, maybe just sit by the window and watch snow fall. Simple things. Quiet things. But meaningful because she'd chosen them rather than letting them be chosen for her. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michelle. Just a photo, the boys building a snowman in their Atlanta yard, their faces red with cold and bright with joy. The message underneath read, "Thinking of you, Mom. Love you." Dorla texted back a heart emoji, the first emoji she'd ever sent, and it felt silly, but also exactly right. Sometimes the simplest gestures carried the most meaning. She locked the cottage and walked toward town, her boots crunching on the dusting of snow that had accumulated overnight. The air was cold and clean, sharp in her lungs. Ridgeline's main street was quiet in the early morning, smoke rising from chimneys, lights glowing in windows. The library stood at the end of the street, its white columns bright against the grey winter sky. As she walked, she thought about the question people sometimes asked. Did she regret buying that land? Regret breaking open that lock? Regret uncovering secrets that had been buried for so long? Never, not once. Not even for a moment, because in finding Vernon Calloway's story, she'd found her own. In choosing to tell his truth, she'd learned to tell hers. In finishing what he couldn't, she'd discovered what she could. The shed still stood on her mountain property, leaning slightly, weathered by time and seasons. The hidden room beneath it was empty now, its secrets surrendered to daylight. But she'd placed a new lock on the door, brass, modern, secure. Not to keep secrets in, but to honor what had been kept there. A reminder that some doors are meant to be opened, some burdens are meant to be shared, some truths are meant to be told. She'd paid $100 for 5 acres of forgotten land. She'd expected nothing, and she'd received everything. A story that mattered, connections that sustained her, purpose that gave meaning to her days. And most importantly, the understanding that at any age, at any moment, it's possible to change direction, to stop running, to choose courage over comfort, to find your way home, even when you didn't know you were lost. The library door opened, and Gretchen waved from inside, a smile on her face. Dorla waved back and quickened her pace, eager to begin the day. There was work to do, stories to preserve, history to honor, and she was ready for all of it. Because she'd learned what Vernon Calloway never had. Peace doesn't come from avoiding hard things. It comes from facing them, from finishing what needs finishing, from telling the truth, no matter how long it's been hidden. And in the telling, in the finishing, in the facing, we find ourselves. Dorla opened the library door and stepped inside, leaving the cold behind. Walking into warmth and light and the rest of her life, a life that mattered, a life she'd chosen, a life that finally was truly hers.